My name is Patricia Kirkpatrick, and I'm one of the many people who have been a part of the planning of this symposium, along with my colleague, Professor Arvind Sharma, one of its conveners. Before and as we begin, it is now our custom to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which was and has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. McGill recognizes, respects, and honors these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today and will continue to meet tomorrow. On behalf of the director of the School of Religious Studies, I welcome you all to the Symposium on Religious Phobia, which has been, yes, 3 years in the making. Whereas we find ourselves in a world where wars have recently begun, and now one which has killed and maimed incredible numbers of innocent civilians and taken hostages of at least 200, I want to make clear that this event was not created with these in mind. That it may help in formulating certain understandings that pertain to the events of war now unfolding in Israel and Gaza remains to be seen. I want, therefore, to clarify for you the history of the thinking that led up to this symposium, and do so with my beloved colleague, Professor Arvind Sharma, Berkeley's Professor of Comparative Religion. Before I do, I want to say something about my understanding of religious phobia within the context of Quebec, not least because given my areas of expertise, which are almost all in the area of religions in ancient history, phobia is not a standard category of description. Autobiographical memory is almost always tinged with a certain romantic nostalgia. So I will try to be as sharp as possible. As it always has been, Quebec of my childhood was a predominantly majority Francophone and at least then Roman Catholic. Mine was an upbringing of privilege that never gave rise to thinking of this Francophone majority as something to fear and to be separate from. My brother and sisters spoke English at home, although the maid, our constant interlocutor, was always only Francophone. All outsiders deemed the city of Westmount, where I lived, an Anglophone bastion, although my immediate neighbors had many Francophone families. My schools were within walking distance, not more than 5 minutes from my elementary school and 20 minutes from the private school I attended as a teenager, both of which were Anglophone and committed to teaching French grammar and literature 45 minutes a day. Every weekend, every holiday, including summers, I lived in what had been my grandmother's country house in what was then the quote-unquote wilds of the tiny Francophone village of Saint-Sever. My best friend at the country house was François Gravel, the son of an Anglophone Scots father and Francophone Quebecois mother. Others who were my playmates were the next-door neighbors, farmers' sons and daughters, none of whom spoke English, all of whom were friends and could be counted on for any kind of help, especially when in trouble. Of course, that's always when you need help, but as a 10-year-old, well, perhaps it wasn't that grave. It was in many respects idyllic and certainly not one that developed phobic responses between Francophone and Anglophone, Roman Catholic and Protestant. Indeed, the writings of the novels, for example, of Gabrielle Roy, and The Two Solitudes of Hugh MacLellan, with their descriptive presentations of community phobias, were something I would learn much later in life. My acquaintance with these notions came only in university here at McGill, Some 50 years ago, when I began to know people from the Anglophone community, from the West Island, and of course, the rest of the world. Even through the periods of terrorism of the Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ, when I saw with my eyes from the windows of my schoolroom a mailbox blow up from a bomb purposed to bring terror to the Anglophone community, I never once identified my Francophone friends as enemies or people to be shunned. And I never understood what people meant when they spoke of les maudites anglaises or les nègres blanches d'Amérique. Indeed, if truth be told, if I had a phobia, it was towards my New English acquaintances of McGill, whose unilingual upbringing and largely isolationist attitudes I did not understand and certainly did not want to adopt. Only later in life would I know better just how complex the milieu in which I grew up and how privileged I had been to have lived in such intersectionalities. The rapid change from a patriarchally and religiously burdened hierarchical society to a modern secular society was transformative of the Quebec intellectual landscape of my youth, which was spoken of in shorthand as at the beginning as la Révolution tranquille. Not to understand this period is to misrepresent Quebec society of a certain period, and as such, to trivialize the enormous transition that occurred as the majority population came into its own. I am proud of this heritage. I respect my part played, which both inhibited and facilitated the transition, which still evolves even as we sleep next to the elephant and nation state to the south of us. It seems unstoppable in its unilingual program of American English. So then, how do I frame phobia? With great difficulty. The linguistic divide and religious denominational dividers, which informed the cultural worlds I lived in, did not greatly influence my phobic attitudes. These, of course, included religion, as there were very deep entrenched phobias against Roman Catholics and Protestants, depending on whether you were Francophone or Anglophone. Yes, I know, this is the religion of the colonizer. This is the religion of the dominant oppressor. Again, my mother's Orthodox, Christian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and Lutheran background taught me from a young age the importance of diversity, the wonderment of difference, and the importance of learning from that which was not like me. My fear towards those of either Francophone or Anglophone origins, though never great, continuously operated as a cautionary trope, warning me against a too easy identification with either group or a too easy understanding of what the other was thinking. So when a religious phobia is discussed, I see it in my mind's eye through the lens of language and my experience of those who, for one reason or another, decided never to learn how to speak to those on the other side of our linguistic divide and shunned the other's religious identity, sometimes to the point of demonization. The physical bombs have now ceased, and the taking hostage of innocent people here in Quebec has not happened for over 50 years. But now, inequalities still threaten identity formation, and new forms of phobias emerge with legislation of potential harm, especially as immigration policies shift and, therefore, the population at large. So, how did this symposium come to be? Back in 2020, when we were deep in confinements from COVID-19, the director of the school, Garth Green, sent me an email to ask if I would be willing to write up a proposal for a grant being offered by the Lilly Foundation, Inc., a foundation which regularly gives money to theological institutions. We are not a theological institution, but we do have a theological program. This time, Lilly, the foundation, were doing so through the professional accreditation body of the American Association of Theological Schools. There was only one hitch. The proposal had to be in the next 27 days. Recklessly, I said yes, as long as I had carte blanche in the construction of the application and would do so on my own and not in a committee. I don't mind committees, I really don't, and I'm quite a team player. It's just that 27 days, you know. To that end, the application was successful, and I began to solicit the help of my colleagues and the community at large in requesting names of potential persons who would help us in the attempt to refresh our understanding of, first of all, interfaith dialogue, something that this faculty, now school, has always been known for, and secondly, the future of theological education in a globalized world. These symposia occurred last year under the Who is My Neighbor banner. The papers from these symposia are now published online, and I think they are continuing to be published online. I know they're missing my paper, right. As I finished the first application to the Lilly Foundation, the director again wrote to me to apply for a second phase grant, this time worth $1 million. This application was significantly more complex, but also included the formation of 3 symposia. The application failed. It was unsuccessful. As I was putting away my electronic files, if indeed one can put them away, I received an email from my colleague, Professor Gerben Ergema, who wanted to know what I had planned to carry forward from the original application ideas. The thought had never occurred to me. I spoke with Arvind and met with Gerben, and it was decided that based on the success of the first 2 symposia, I should try to see if the Canadian Ecumenical Centre was willing to partner in such a venture, and if so, could we apply the Connections Grant from the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Council? For those of you who are not Canadian, this is the council that provides so many of us in terms of researchers and graduate students with funding for the projects that we may have. As you know, or perhaps as you don't know if you're not Canadian, our university system is public. But there was a turn in the road at this stage while organizing the speakers for the conference, and I have Dean D, Dean of Arts of the Regina University, to thank. I invited her, I can't remember how long ago it was now, Dean, to join our merry group of sojourners, and she wrote back to me saying that whereas she had thought about human rights within the context of the Academy, she was not herself an expert in any of the religions mentioned, and therefore was perhaps the wrong person to be asking. Perhaps I had read the wrong article. At that very moment, when I thought that I had better look for someone else, my colleague, Professor Dan Siri, mentioned the fact that he was thinking of suggesting to the Steinman family, the family which has generously provided the funds for an annual lecture in honor and memory of Seymour David Steinman, that we invite someone interested in human rights, as this was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in order to speak of this in relation to Judaism's central role. As we spoke about the lecture and the conference, we decided that the conference could support this idea of human rights as well as the phobic, and would offer an opportunity to discuss the issues not only within the religious realms of Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam, but also so using the secular category of human rights. So our third symposium in the series, Who is My Neighbor, was born. And I thank all of you for taking a chance and coming here this morning to share your thoughts. But I will leave now my colleague Arvind to say more about the conceptual ideas.
Thank you, Pat, and good morning to everyone. I think I'll begin by adding my own word of welcome to that extended by Professor Kirkpatrick, and then ask all of you a simple question. If I take the word, or if I utter the word swastika, what comes next to your mind? Anybody? Yes.
Racism.
Yes. Nazism, racism. So you can imagine my considerable surprise when I discovered, within my limited knowledge of Germany, that the word is never used in the Nazi literature itself. That symbol is always referred to as the hooked cross, or Hakenkreuz, if I have pronounced the word correctly. So I paused and wondered that for 50 years, Hinduism had been subliminally associated with racism and Nazism, when it had nothing to do with it. This completely astonished me. Then, several decades ago, I was going through the New York Times, and I read the following statement therein. In Islam, women have no soul. This is New York Times. I thought of Rabia, the famous Muslim mystic. When other Sufis proposed marriage to her, she said, yes, let us talk. Let me tell you what my concerns are. My concerns are, when I die and Munkar and Nakir ask me questions about my faith, will I be able to answer them correctly? And they all said, this is one of those hidden things. Then she said, will I come out as a believer or an unbeliever? And they said, it is one of those hidden things. Then she said, will the Nama-i-Amal, my book of deeds, be handed to me in my right hand or my left hand? They said, it is one of those hidden things. And finally she said, on the day of judgment, will I go to heaven or to hell? And they said, it is one of those hidden things. And so she said, if you are as much in the dark as I am, I see no point in pursuing the matter. Now, in the face of this, for a paper like the New York Times to make this statement is really astonishing. But the same paper has also said at times that the University of McGill is located in Toronto. And it is surprising, actually, how many people think that McGill University is located in Toronto. And the Noble newspaper made its own contribution in this direction. Then I thought of my own days as a student of comparative religion, studying the history of Judaism. When I came to know of the document known as the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, according to which the Jews were plotting to take over the whole earth. Right? And it is a well-known forgery. So when I thought of these things, I said, under which rubric can we take up the investigation of these matters? And it seemed to me that the obvious ones were those of Hinduphobia, as our discourse goes, current discourse, Hinduphobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Now, when we examine these three examples, we find something in common among them. They suppress the truth and they project the falsehood, or what we might otherwise call as suppressio veri and suggestio falsi. And I found it fascinating that there is a corresponding idea in Hindu thought. When we discuss the concept of Maya, it's a very well-known concept within Hinduism, then similar ideas can be identified. What is Maya? Maya is the unreal as compared to the real. Unreality is Maya, and the real, of course, is the ultimate truth. Now, two features are supposed to characterize Maya. Avaran, which is concealment, and vikshep, which is projection. I found this fascinating. Now, in an earlier age, we could look upon these examples as marginal issues, something which might even amuse us as to how things can be misstated or how they can be perceived wrongly. But I don't think we have this luxury anymore in the age of social media, because these ideas become the main markers of those traditions, given the way things unfold in the media, so on the social media. So the question arises, what can we do about it? Now that we can no longer ignore it, and it has to be combated, what do we do about it? Here I think the word phobia comes to our help. The dictionary meaning of the word phobia states that a phobia is an irrational fear of something. Somebody may have a fear of flying because the person feels that his plane might crash. Now, of course, planes crash. But it has not prevented normal people from flying. So, if we are in the academia, where we are supposed to put a premium on rationality, then we can engage rationality to counter the fear. If phobia is an irrational fear of something. Now, when we try to do that, we have reason in our favor, but we know that a phobia is really an emotion. And so the question arises, to what extent can reason counter emotion? Now, if we go back to the example of the person who has a phobia of flying, I think it is possible that over a period of time, when the person is exposed to the facts that accidents do occur, planes do crash, but not at regular intervals. This is an exception. And is confronted with the facts of life, as we experience it, that thousands of people have flown and survived those flights, that over time, this form of rationality may actually have the effect of undermining the fear. And I think it is in this hope that we meet today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, then let's begin. And it's to my colleague, Professor Gerben Oegema, Professor of Biblical Studies, and particularly of Second Temple period, that I give over now to session one.
Yeah, so good morning. My name is Gerben Oegema, and I kind of feel encouraged by Patricia and Arvind to also share a little bit about my encounters with phobia, which are very different. I'm from the Netherlands, and I told my students on Tuesday that we had to memorize in school, elementary school, the dates and the atrocities and the cities the Spanish had committed more than 400 years ago. And I still remember that, yeah? So we had to learn it by heart. Now, there were many other things we had to learn. And looking back, I think that had a lot to do with my phobia. I was scared to death of Catholics, of Spanish. I never wanted to meet any one of them. Of course, we were also very scared of the Germans. I never wanted to go meet them. We also had members of a competing church. And I remember as a kid, I would always walk with my friends in a wide circle around them. So my life as a kid was full of phobia. And it took a long time, and I think traveling and meeting other people and studying to gradually learn about life. And here I am introducing this panel, and I'm grateful to be accepted as a second-class citizen in Quebec, or third-class citizen in Quebec. I'm happy with my role, and I'm wonderful. I'm so happy to be at McGill, which prior to McGill and prior to the people from Quebec was already a meeting place, and I think this is really the best thing we have, the university setting, as a place to talk in freedom about all the differences we have. So, with that, having said that, I'm happy to introduce to you Professor Shannon Dea, who will be our first speaker. We have a third speaker at the list who is not coming today. That is Professor Indu Vishwanatha. She apologizes, she is very sick, she was not able to come. So we start with our first speaker. Professor Shannon Dea is Professor of Philosophy and Dean of Arts at the University of Regina in Canada. She is the creator of University Affairs Dispatches on Academic Freedom column and the author of multiple scholarly and semi-popular pieces on academic and expressive freedom. She is also the author of Beyond the Binary, Thinking About Sex and Gender, Broadview 2016, and of numerous articles and book chapters on pragmatism, history of philosophy, social philosophy, and gender studies. Professor Dea lives and works on Treaty 4, the territory of the Nehi Yavak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. She will speak about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and academic freedom. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for the introduction. Do you want me at the podium? Do you care?
Well, it's because you won't be able to see your slides. You're going to have to turn them off.
Okay, yeah, I'll go to the podium. Not because I want to stand higher, just because I want to see my slides and advance them. And that probably... Sorry, one mic is probably... I'm not doing any origami or anything back here, just trying to avoid things falling to the floor in the middle of the talk. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and my thanks to Professors Kirkpatrick and Sharma and to the Department of Religious Studies, McGill University, and all of the funders for the opportunity to have this conversation with you today. I have too much material, and so I'll be optimistic at first, and then I'll start to panic and race through the slides too quickly. I'll do the best that I can to keep us moving on time. So I want to start, and I always wear this little orange t-shirt pin every single day. Those of you who live and work in Canada will know that this has become the symbol of truth and reconciliation in Canada. I gave a talk in Amsterdam last year, and they thought I was a supporter of the national football team. I forgot to explain why I was wearing the pin. I want to gratefully acknowledge that we are coming together here today on Tiohtià:ke, which is currently called Montreal. It's situated on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of this land, but many people have lived and worked and studied and learned on this land and stewarded it together. Tiohtià:ke has long been a gathering place for many First Nations. And as you've already heard, I am a settler scholar who seeks to walk lightly in accordance with the treaties on Treaty 4 territory, the homeland of the Métis Nation, and the territory of the Nihilwak, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, the Lakota, and the Nakota. I'm going to be very careful in this talk. I didn't expect that the introduction to the whole conference would refer to my reluctance to speak outside of my own lane, but let me say a little bit more about that again. I'm very cognizant both that I'm not a religious studies scholar, but also that neither I nor anyone in my family, in living family memory, has ever been subject to religious phobia. And so I want to be really careful to make clear that I primarily come here as someone who works on academic freedom and expressive freedom on campus, and the intersection of those freedoms with equity, diversity, and inclusion. And clearly that has application to religious phobia because religious phobia plays out in so many violations of human rights and equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I probably should have flipped the title and the subtitle because I'll focus more on academic freedom and the duty of care in the hopes that that can offer a helpful framing for some of the difficult conversations that we will have over the next couple of days and some of the difficult conversations that we will continue to have for the rest of our lives. So while I will have to skip some slides, I'm sure, because I always make too many, the two main things I want to make clear here are a commitment that threads through all of my work and that I would recommend to all of you as well. And a kind of question that I'll partially start to work through, but I hope that we can think through it together a little bit. So that commitment is to the notion that academic freedom, properly understood, is the right kind of freedom for universities, for campuses, as opposed to broader expressive freedom as protected in various constitutions. And it is so because it is a freedom designed, created in order to advance the academic mission. But to advance the academic mission, we need more than freedoms. We need, among other things, like labs and lecture halls and so forth, we need scholars and students and human beings, right, who need to be able to come to this space together in a place of safety and flourishing in order to pursue the inquiry that they pursue. And so throughout my work, I argue that if we can shift the way we talk about campus freedoms to academic freedom, this purposive freedom that's intended to advance the academic mission, then we are obliged to balance it against the other kinds of things that are required for the academic mission, including the duty of care that universities and colleges owe to their students and employees. So that's my commitment. And a lot of my talk will be about that as a kind of framing then for the specific question that relates to the specific topic of this symposium. And the question is, does this view help us know what to do when religious phobias, and I'm going to focus in particular on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, show up on campus? And in particular, does it help us navigate current student protests over Israel and Palestine? You'll be unsatisfied with the answer, but I hope to start working through what that answer might look like. I want to make clear from the outset that the context really, really matters. I am a Canadian scholar who writes for a primarily Canadian audience when I write about academic freedom, because the American context is very different because of the influence of the First Amendment, right? And in particular, in the American context, there's a big division between public and private schools insofar as they are bound or not bound by the First Amendment. But there's also a very strong culture of free expression in the US that flows from that commitment to the First Amendment. I try to provide advice outside of that context. Canada is very much under the shadow of some of those discussions, but we operate in a different kind of constitutional context and a different higher education context. And I thought these images actually illustrate it quite nicely. I should have figured out which American college is represented on the right. Honestly, I just Googled American college with American flag, and this one was pretty. And so if you recognize it, then tell me later and I'll buy you a coffee or a beer or whatever you prefer. I thought that I would like a picture of McGill with a Canadian flag, and of course there are no pictures of McGill with Canadian flags because you don't tend to fly Canadian flags in Quebec. McGill is part of Anglo-Quebec. I know I'm butchering it for McGill people, please forgive me, but is disinclined for various reasons to fly the Quebec flag. So typically the flag that flies over McGill buildings is McGill's own flag, which is a really nice compromise. But I thought it was really interesting that once a year, McGill flies a flag that's based on the wampum belt of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so that's the Confederacy of Indigenous Nations that includes the Kaningahaga people, who I referred to in my land acknowledgement. And I think that you get a sense not only that we're dealing with different countries here, but very different cultures because of how what a striking difference it is to hang a wampum belt flag over a university building, right? And so, again, staying in my lane, I hope that the principles that I seek to advance are useful beyond Canada, but they're designed for Canada, for a place that doesn't have the First Amendment. It's also really important, and this will, I hope, come through in my remarks, to notice the other kinds of contextual features that play into academic freedom on campus, but also some of those phobias and human rights challenges that occur on campus. University campuses are constitutively colonial. We often talk about their colonial past, but we didn't leave it behind. We continue to, we were constructed that way and haven't decolonized any university successfully, although a number are certainly trying to decolonize. And so I always want to talk about both colonial pasts and presents, and I put those in plural because there wasn't just one colonial past and there isn't just one colonial present. That's going to vary by context as well. This is an image from an Indian residential school in Canada, and something that I'm always really attentive to is the fact that educational institutions have been sites of abuse and hatred and racism and indoctrination and cultural genocide, not just in Canada, but I focus in particular on Canada. And we have a particular duty, I think, to ensure that not only do we make reparations, but that we attend to how dangerous educational institutions can feel to some folks based on their race, their embodiment, their indigeneity, and to take some care to start to change that, right? We also, I think, in terms of the context of universities, need to be aware of not just the higher level violations of human rights that cross an obvious threshold, but microaggressions and other smaller aggregate harms. And so we know that folks who are equity denied across various axes experience constant low-level microaggressions that where each one of them in isolation might be nothing to complain about, but over time have an aggregate effect on their experience of the learning environment, right? And it's really important that we have the right conceptual framework and instruments to take seriously those kinds of experiences as well. And that's my time, just kidding. So something I'm always at pains to do is to distinguish between freedom of expression and academic freedom. Very often in popular and media discourse, the two get conflated together. And very often, even university presidents talk about the importance of freedom of expression on their campuses. And they will sometimes do so without even talking about academic freedom, decide that is purpose-built for universities. While they are related, they are importantly distinct, and I think it is very important for those of us who are trying to do this kind of work understand the distinction between the two. Freedom of expression, which worldwide is codified in various kinds of constitutional documents. In countries without constitutions, there's often a kind of common law version that's not codified. And so there are lots of different applications of it around the world. Wherever freedom of expression is recognized, it is typically understood to be held by all, citizen or non-citizen, irrespective of line of work. It is held to be something innate and something inalienable, right? So you're born with it and you can't lose it. Right? Just because you're a person, you have it because you're a person. Freedom of expression doesn't bring with it any kind of expectation of quality control. One of the main goals of protecting freedom of expression is to allow a proliferation of views. The goal isn't to necessarily zero in on the correct view, right? And that's appropriately humble, actually, because it reflects a recognition that we can't always know what the right view is, and so allowing a proliferation of views helps to ensure that we're not inadvertently silencing the right view. And in most accounts of why we recognize freedom of expression, it's taken to support individual fulfillment and individual actualization. And so it's very much held by individuals for individuals. By contrast, academic freedom is typically held by academic staff, although, for instance, in Latin America, students have good academic freedom protections. But at least it's held by academics. As I've been at pains to say, it is devised for the purpose of supporting the academic mission, and that purpose serves society. It can be very easy when you're a professor who's advocating for your own academic freedom to treat it like it's an individual right, but you don't have it because you're entitled to it as an individual. You have it because of the scholarly work that you do for the university in the service of society. We created it in order to serve society. I'm going to skip this. We're already at the skipping stage, but I think we're fine so far. So the duty of care, I alluded to it earlier, and it's in the title, is one of the many other things besides academic freedom that universities need to defend and do well in order to advance the academic mission. And again, thinking about academic freedom as purposive, as supporting the academic mission, it doesn't work in isolation. A bunch of other things support the academic mission as well. So even if you didn't care about the human rights of equity-denied folks at universities, you should, for just epistemological reasons or epistemic reasons, want them to participate in the academic mission of the university as part of strengthening the academic mission of the university, right? In addition, though, it's really important to remember that universities aren't just sites of scholarship. They are homes and workplaces. Insofar as the university is a landlord, it has a duty to ensure that that home is safe for everyone who lives there. And insofar as an employer, it has a duty to ensure that it is a safe workplace in which everyone who works there can flourish, right? Those are both legal and ethical duties. But again, context matters. How exactly to perform that duty varies from context to context, right? So what's going to feel safe for learners and workers is going to depend a lot on the culture of the institution. And by culture, I'm talking about things like if there has been a long tradition of a certain kind of phobia or racism or exclusionary practice, then we should take even more seriously microaggressions experienced by those equity-denied groups, right? So the threshold of that duty of care is going to vary context by context. I don't know if we'll get through both of these. I thought, having given that high-level overarching framework, we could start to work through a little bit to see whether that line of thinking helps us in a couple of cases, a couple of recent cases relating to religious phobia, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, and the an incident with an art history professor at Hamline University in Minnesota who was accused of Islamophobia. Let's start here. So this is a definition many of you, most of you perhaps will be familiar with it. It was formally adopted in 2016, although it existed for over a decade before then, and since then has been adopted by something like 30 countries, many Canadian provinces. That's again where my specialization is. And there's been enormous controversy over this definition. The definition itself is quite minimalist and quite general, because anti-Semitism takes many forms, and it was intended to be flexible and adaptable to various kinds of cases. The definition is accompanied by 11 examples of anti-Semitism, 7 of which relate to speech about Israel. And that's where the controversy has really emerged. There's considerable disagreement, both among Jewish groups and among non-Jews, about the extent to which and the ways in which speech about Israel should be factored into or included in the definition of anti-Semitism. The adoption of the IHRA definition by various countries and provinces and universities has created an enormous amount of controversy. It ripped the British Labour Party into in around 2016. The Canadian Association of University Teachers opposes the application of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in Canadian universities. I want to stay agnostic at this time on whether the IHR definition ought to apply to universities, whether it ought to be enshrined in law. It's not what it was intended for. It's worth saying it's a working definition because it's intended as a tool for identifying instances or incidents of anti-Semitism for scholars, right? But it has now been adopted into the legal domain by a number of governments. I want to remain kind of agnostic about all of that and consider what we do on campuses when controversy around this definition blows up, or perhaps even before it blows up. Again, thinking about that notion of balancing academic freedom with the duty of care, so ensuring that scholars have the protected right to ask really tough, uncomfortable, controversial questions, to engage in controversial lines of scholarship on the one hand, but to balance that against the need to steward our spaces so that they are safe for learners and employees and community members. does that help us think through the university's relationship with the IHRA definition? I think that as I started to ponder that question, it helped to clarify for me something that has been unstated in my work, but has been a lurking notion behind it the whole time. So it was a helpful exercise for me. I'll start with a kind of negative claim or a pessimistic claim. By the time a question about academic freedom or about human rights and justice on campus reaches the juridical stage, where there's been a formal complaint or there's a grievance, et cetera, I think that the ship has already, to a great extent, sailed on doing that careful balancing work between academic freedom and the duty of care. Once you're dealing with that juridical context, you're bound by the particular collective agreement. If you find yourself in litigation, you're bound by the particular law. And so there's less opportunity to balance then. At that point, you're just applying the law or the collective agreement article to the case. So when do we get the chance to balance academic freedom and the duty of care when there are disagreements about things like the IHRA definition? Well, sooner rather than later, and before it reaches the state of a formal complaint. And so, in 2016, when the IHRA definition was first adopted officially, would probably have been a really good time for universities to start conversations with their students, their academic staff, their community members about what that means for them. I will say, again, the controversial aspect of this definition is associating speech about Israel with anti-Semitism. That's exactly the kind of discussion that universities can have well if they have them early on before they're having to be legally cautious and responding to a particular complaint, right? And as I said, there are deep disagreements on both sides about the relationship between speech about Israel and anti-Semitism, but it's not merely an academically interesting question. There are deep disagreements about whether light is a wave or a particle, right? But you don't then go home and as far as I know, if you know physicists who are really feeling trauma about this, let me know. But I don't think that physicists then have to go home to generations of hatred they've experienced because of their physical commitments and continue to work through that pain, right? We need to be really aware that when we're dealing with scholarly disagreement and scholarship in general that relates to histories of hatred, that we can't treat them as just abstract academic matters, right? So we should have been early on at universities having really good, rich conversations about the IHRA definition, and whether universities ended up adopting it or not, seeking to better understand why lots of Jewish organizations say, no, speech about Israel really has to be part of the definition, and here's why. Right? But we should have been having those conversations in a way that attended to the particular social locations of the folks involved and to the need to have that careful, caring approach towards all of the members of the university community. Right. Hamline University, most of you be familiar with this case as well. This was just over a year ago that a sessional instructor of art history gave students a content warning that in a few minutes she would be showing a piece of medieval Islamic art with a representation, an imagistic representation of the Prophet Muhammad. She gave them that warning because she was cognizant that many Muslim students would not want to be present for an imagistic representation of the Prophet. And she wanted them to have the chance to step out for a few minutes if that's what they needed to do. A member of the Muslim Students Association wrote to the university administration and issued a very strong complaint, said that it was Islamophobic for the professor to show this piece of art. The university very quickly reacted. The media has wrongly characterized them as having terminated the professor's contract, and that's not quite right. This was a sessional instructor. They just didn't hire her anymore, right? And the matter is in litigation, and there may be other details behind the scenes that I'm not aware of that change the complexion of the case. But the way it got represented in the media was that academic freedom had been badly undercut because a professor had been fired for showing a piece of art representing the prophet. Oh no, I had a really great slide that was helpful, and oh no, here it is. This was a helpful slide. Great job, Shannon. I think one of the most helpful analyses I've seen of this case was by Sahar Aziz and Al Jazeera, who said actually the really big academic freedom problem is universities' reliance on contract academic staff and how vulnerable those contract academic staff are in cases like this, and the ways in which that can have a chilling effect on different kinds of scholarship and teaching, right? But she wisely didn't take sides and say, oh, it's academic freedom and to heck with the rest of it. She said, but the Muslim students had every right to complain. That's part of their appropriate expression on campus as well. When something pinches for them and feels harmful and inappropriate, they have every right to complain. That was perfectly reasonable, and she notes that there was a documented history of Islamophobia at Hemline, right? So again, that's that bit about context and microaggressions. On Aziz's view, the case in question was actually perfectly appropriate. The professor was an expert in the area who gave an appropriate content warning and taught an appropriate canon of medieval Muslim art, right? But the students don't know what's appropriate academic canon. They're still learning that, right? But if they've been experiencing throughout their entire time at the college Islamophobia, then they're going to be on alert, and that's natural too, right? It's the university's duty to reckon with that holistic situation, right? That the teacher is teaching within her canon, within her expertise. The students have every right to complain, and the students have been dealing with Islamophobia. Oh, and also the teacher is a precarious academic staff member and is under different kinds of constraints, therefore, than other academic staff. It never would have happened with a tenured member. How does the notion of balancing academic freedom and the duty of care help here? Well, I mean, Aziz does it, right? She says we have to care for the students, and we should have been, Hemline should have been paying serious attention to the Islamophobia they all experienced and seen this not as a reason to vilify this professor, but as a reason to do something serious about the Islamophobia experienced by the students, right? At the same time, they should have been cognizant of the dangers of relying on precarious academic staff and exposing them to this kind of punishment in the face of a student complaint, right? And so there's no conflict, it turns out, despite the way it was represented in the media, between academic freedom and the duty of care, if you pull back and understand the situation carefully rather than individualistically and reactively and in an ad hoc way, right? It could have been an opportunity to address two injustices. So, I told you that my answers would be kind of unsatisfying. They're still pretty high level, but and they don't solve the problem once things have already gone off the rails, right? But they can, I think, if we cultivate these kinds of principles and values, can help us to have the right kinds of conversations early on. But also when there is a student complaint, they can help us to pull back and pause and say, okay, let's think about this systemically and think about this in terms of both academic freedom and the duty of care. The questions that we need to engage when religious phobia makes its way onto campus remain tough questions, But I think that this kind of framing helps us to give careful, if finite and flawed and human answers, rather than dogmatic, pat answers. Right? And certainly the language of free expression, as it is advanced in the popular media and popular discourse, is monolithic and pat and does not admit of careful balancing of our various duties. Right? One last note, and this really aligns with some of the remarks that Professor Sharma made earlier. I think that Professor Kirkpatrick invited me to speak here because of a column I wrote about the IHRA definition a couple of years ago. And my first sentence of that column said something like, I was afraid to write this column. And just so you know, I'm afraid to give this talk right now. Not because I have stage fright, that's not me, but because of that wanting to stay in my lane and be cognizant of histories of hatred and not want to do any further violence. I think that seeking to balance academic freedom with the duty of care helps us to cultivate university spaces that are safer and therefore allow us to be braver to do scary things, right? And I want to commend to you as my final remark the work of feminist philosopher Amy Harbin, who doesn't think fear is always a bad thing. We've heard from Professor Sharma that phobia is certainly a bad thing. It is monolithic, it is hateful, it is irrational, right? Harbin argues that we can fear badly, and that fearing badly is a species of moral failure. But she also argues that we can fear better, that fearing better together can be the beginnings of moral repair. And what I mean by adopting Harbin and counseling that we adopt fearing better is that I think when we are overconfident that, oh, it's the First Amendment and it's violated and rah-rah freedom of expression, we are not fearful enough, right? We're not sufficiently afraid of the harm we might do and of the things that we might not understand. By seeking to balance those more careful and nuanced kinds of rights and duties, I think we allow a space to be a little bit afraid of what we might not know, who we might hurt, and I hope that that'll make us more careful in times that will continue to be difficult and scary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very clarifying presentation in which you say indeed there are different contexts, Canada, the United States, different expression of freedom, academic freedom, and I also appreciate that at the end you don't give an answer, and I think many universities presently struggle with finding an answer, yes? Patricia, do we have one minute time for a question, or you want to do the questions at the end? Yes, so we have some time for questions, and then we move on to Professor Hussain. So just an example, and then I'll ask for questions. Our university sent out an email last week to everyone, students and staff, which kind of showed they were in despair about all the cases of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic emails and behavior they witnessed, and they didn't really have an answer, and they asked from all of us, please show compassion. And it added to it, we know this is a big ask. Yeah? So that was their response. What do you think of that?
I think they're right that we should show compassion, but I don't think that an official email from a university administrator has ever caused somebody to start being compassionate. And I'm a dean, right? I mean, I think it's not about sending out an email and saying, okay, be compassionate now. That's almost juridical as well, right? I mean, we need to foster the space for conversations and careful, tough conversations in which we recognize our finitude and vulnerability and find a space for compassion together, right? An email's not going to do it.
Yeah. No, to me, it also sounded like we have nothing else to offer. Yeah, please, compassion. Of course, the context is also many decades of secularism, and of course in Quebec, no education of religions anymore. So no one has a chance to even practice dialogue. Anyways, yes, you have a question, and please, yes, please use the microphone and please say your name. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughtful remark. I really appreciated the nuance and the complexity and not coming to an answer, because I think that it's going to be different in different contexts. My name is Suhag Shukla. I'm the executive director of the Hindu American Foundation. I'm also a lawyer. I was wondering if you have thought about the impact of scholar activism in this conversation about academic freedom and the duty of care. I'm going to be talking a lot about that later today. And as I was looking things up for what we face as the Hindu community in the United States, scholar activism plays a big role, not a positive one, unfortunately. So what are your thoughts on the place of scholar activism and how it might collide? I'm giving my view there, but with the duty of care and academic freedom.
I think that's, it's one of the toughest issues, and was actually a big turning point for me in my academic freedom research, because I came to academic freedom. I don't know how far this is being broadcast, don't tell me because it'll scare me, but I came to academic freedom because my university was very close to, at the time, to the University of Jordan B. Peterson, who was saying hateful things about trans students and refusing to use trans students' pronouns. And before I knew anything about academic freedom, I thought, he's a psychologist, he's a clinical psychologist, he should stay in his lane. He doesn't have the right to be out giving rallies in the Quad or speaking at rallies in the Quad about legal matters and matters of gender identity that are beyond his expertise. And I think that's a pretty strong intuitive response that we all have. As I learned more and more about academic freedom, I came to disagree with my own earlier view, even though it'd be really convenient to agree with it, because I still wish, in retrospect, I could have found a way to shut that guy up. But it's worth saying, academic freedom has had various historical moments. The version that we know today in North America is about a century old. It was the creation of the American Association of University Professors under the presidency of John Dewey. And the reason that they came together to form the association and to articulate those principles of academic freedom that evolved into a statement that's adopted by most US universities today was because college trustees were firing faculty for their extramural expression beyond their expertise. And that was the thing they were trying to block against, because they realized, again, in this notion that universities serve society, society comes to professors for our opinions about matters that are of importance to society. I often say that we want our Professor Einsteins to be able to talk about world peace, not just about physics. So we want them to be able to engage in extramural expression beyond their academic expertise. I still hew to that view, and I actually think one of the further reasons to hew to the view is that equity denied scholars and scholars in emerging areas, like critical race theory, which has been so beleaguered in the US for the last 4 years or so. I think in those emerging areas, speech looks extramural and perhaps activist until it coalesces into a new discipline, and any kind of limit that we might set on, a white cis male clinical psychology professor is going to be used even more strongly against equity denied scholars. All of which is to say that I think that extramural expression must be protected as part of academic freedom, and it's very, very tricky to draw a line between extramural expression and activism. If a professor gives a speech on the Quad about Palestine, as happened yesterday, a number of professors here yesterday at the student walkout gave speeches about Palestine, and they weren't experts on Palestine. That is probably activism just as much as it's extramural expression, but it's protected for a reason. But then that becomes part of the tricky puzzle to be solved that's not going to be resolved in a restorative way once we get to the juridical space. But that's why it's so important for universities early on to do a really good job of cultivating an understanding of those various values and duties that are necessary in defense of the academic mission. I'm so sorry I give such long answers, but that's my view. I might have burned through all the time with that answer.
Thank you so much. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful talk. And my question follows on just about the question of stakeholders or advocacy organizations, which can be resources to students, right, and even to administrators and to faculty, but they have an ambiguous relationship to the university.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, you just sketched out for us a kind of capsule history of academic freedom, you know. Do you think in the perfect world in which we could build these conversations beforehand, there should be a kind of rethinking about how universities interact with the public sphere and those organizations? Or is it more important to kind of say that can't be, you know, that can't be central to the reasoning inside a bounded community of a university?
I'll start at the end of your question and work my way to the beginning if I can remember to do that. I will give a little bit of biography. I am a first-generation university student, not even a first-generation PhD student. I was a first-generation university student. None of my people ever went to university. And I've spent my entire career in the publicly funded Canadian university system. And so for a couple of reasons, I'm really committed to the notion that universities serve society, and they need to serve society in a myriad of ways, not just by, you know, doing aeronautical engineering, right? We engage with the public on matters of interest to the public because we are respected as experts and maybe even wise in some of those areas. And I prefer that to the kind of cloistered medieval university where only the members had any participation in it. But it makes it messier and harder. And when you talk about outside organizations, one of the challenges, right, it's really easy. So let's say a professor invites a white nationalist speaker to campus. If the professor does it, they do so under, at least in Canada, where we have strong faculty unions and good academic freedom protections, they do so under the umbrella of their academic freedom. If a student group invites that same speaker, it's really borderline whether they have the right to do so. And if the student group is actually fully funded and directed by some outside organization, then it's more difficult still to figure out whether they should be here. And again, once the poster has gone up, it's too late to work through all of those challenges. My really untutored answer, and it won't be helpful to anybody, is that some community groups and organizations are perfectly appropriate partners to support students in their community-engaged scholarly and activist work. But some of them are wildly inappropriate. One of the concerns that I've had, and I don't think this is who you're referring to, but I've been deeply concerned about the ways in which a whole whack of Koch Foundation money has shifted scholarly areas across North America, right? If you put enough money into inquiry into a particular ideological perspective, then suddenly everybody's going to specialize in that area, and it's going to create the impression to the public that it's a really important area, right? So I'm very worried about funding and support from outside groups where there's no tidy answer. Sorry, philosophers just say it's complicated, there's no tidy answer. I'm sorry to be such a typical philosopher.
All right. Wonderful. Yes, so it's now my pleasure to invite Professor Amir Hussain, who is Professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches courses on Islam, focusing on contemporary Muslim societies in North America. He's the author or editor of 5 books and over 60 scholarly articles and book chapters about religion. He was an advisor for the TV series The Story of God with Morgan Freeman and appears regularly on Ancient Aliens and the Unexplained with William Shatner. In 2008, he was appointed a Fellow of the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities. He is president of the American Academy of Religion and previously served as the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. And he will speak about Better Feared Than Hated, Islamophobia, Miso-Islamia, and the lives of Muslims in North America. Please welcome Professor Hussain.
Good morning. Thank you to Professor Sharma and Professor Kirkpatrick for inviting me, and to Dr. Rossini for the arrangements and everything else. It's great to be here. I'll say more about being here in a second. My students actually prefer it if I stand, just because they tell me I'm a little less boring if I stand. I'm much more boring if I sit, and so I try to take their advice here. But recognizing, of course, that when I did this, it was long before 2 weeks ago. And so in light of what's happening, as a good Muslim boy living in Los Angeles, I have lots and lots of rabbis I can turn to. Sort of my rabbi, and I'm not joking about this, like my last book starts with Rabbi Sharon Brous at Ikar and a sermon that she gave at Rosh Hashanah. So I was actually at Ikar, which is Hebrew for essence, this amazing synagogue in Los Angeles, and Sharon sent this out to her congregation on the 9th, and it's really extraordinary, there, that do we have this false binary, and I love the way that she ends. In fact, the only liberation will be a shared liberation. The only justice is a justice for all. I think it's important to keep that in mind. I'm looking at Arvind thinking, I need to learn more. I think it's actually a Jain teaching about the multi-sidedness of reality. This idea that we have just like two sides to this, as if it's the Israelis and the Palestinians or the left and the right. It's like, no, that there's multiple sides here, and how do we understand that? And it's not mutually exclusive here, and so you have to start with literally what's happening. But then you think, okay, what's been happening before this? And I'm delighted that Shannon started with the treaty acknowledgement. And you think about, okay, what does it mean to be back here for me as a Canadian back in Canada? And you think in 2021, the events that folks in Canada know with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the discovery of bodies at graves, at former residential schools. This was the Haida artist who'd done this installation at the Vancouver Art Gallery of 215 pairs of children's shoes, from the 215 graves at Kamloops residential school. What does it mean to have over 200 children missing and murdered? And then our own Prime Minister Trudeau, literally the month later, this is in London, Ontario, at the funeral memorial for the Afzal family, the Muslim family basically killed for walking while Muslim, a grandmother, a mother, a father, and a sister run down by a man in a truck. And so this idea that these things matter. What we're talking about really does matter here. And then it's great to be here at McGill. I say that as someone who has no academic connection with McGill. I did my work at the University of Toronto, but with my mentor, who held the chair that Arvind holds now, the Burks Professor of Comparative Religion, Wilfred Cantwell-Smith, this extraordinary scholar of religion. And John Peters Humphreys, most Americans think Eleanor Roosevelt wrote the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We know here at McGill that it was a McGill lawyer, a law professor, John Peters Humphrey, who did this, and this is the 75th anniversary, not just of the Faculty of Religious Studies here at McGill, but the 75th anniversary of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I know that Patrice, but I think Patrice is actually in Nigeria as we speak and is coming tomorrow. He and I, when we were both graduate students in the last century, worked with John Humphrey in the World Conference on Religion and Peace. So there's fascinating sort of connection. Like Shannon, I'm first generation, first person in the family to go to university, and to have the connections with people like Wilfred, like John, I think are crucial, and I'll talk about them. You know, for Wilfred, it really was about this academic study of religion. Is the faith is about the persons. You know, we're talking about people here, not things, not ideas, but people and the things that those people do here. So a little bit about Islamophobia, as people may be aware, the word comes into use really not that long ago. 1997, a little over 25 years ago, a famous thing by the Runnymede Trust. And I love that definition, a useful shorthand way of referring to dread or hatred of Islam, and therefore to fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. And I want to talk a little bit about that, you know, what that means, if that's the correct term or not. A lot of really good work done on this. I'd used Jim Wolfrey's book deliberately here because being here in Quebec, a lot of connection for Quebec with what happens in France. And his analysis, I think, of what's happening with Islamophobia, and I love that if you can see the subtitle, The Rise of Respectable Racism in France, a Republic of Islamophobia. Absolutely, it's a really, really great book. I think Olivier Roy is my own personal favorite for someone writing about Muslims in France, but Jim's book, I think, is really, really important. And then this book that just came out last year, edited by Andre Ayman at the University of Toronto, on systemic Islamophobia in Canada, a research agenda. And I draw your attention to those books because I think they're really, really important if you're trying to understand the context here of what's going on. And again, I'll make a little bit of reference to both of those books in a second. I brought one of them with me. I didn't bring the other one just because Mr. Hussain, traveling on the plane, bringing books, one book about Islamophobia is actually okay with TSA. Two, you start to get a little suspicious, and things happen there. But that question of, is it really a fear? Professor Sharma talked about that, irrational fear. Is it actually a hatred, not a fear of Muslims? Is it better to be feared than respected, to use, realpolitik kinds of language? Or is it really about Islam? Then candidate Trump in 2016, very famously in front of Anderson Cooper, said, "I think Islam hates us." It's sort of really interesting there to say, okay, is it the religion? Is it the people? Is it both? Is it better? And it's hard to use Greek and Latin terms along with the Arabic because, of course, you're dealing with Semitic languages and Indo-European languages. Is it like miso-Islamia, like, the fear of the hatred of Islam? But then living in LA, people think that's like soup, Muslimodium. Is it odia, the hatred? But that sounds like Imodium, and that's not great. There's no great way of putting these things together. So I'm not sure how to talk about this, but it's there. It's here, True story. Montreal is my favorite city in North America, except for the weather. The weather's awful, but other than the weather, I love this city. I've got tickets to go see the Habs Saturday night, play the Jets. I'll be walking up Saturday morning to visit with another one of my rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, also known as Lenny Cohen, at the Shar HaShomayim cemetery there. I love this city. And I haven't been to this city since 2018 because of Bill 21. That's a personal choice on my part to say, if the Quebec government, and I'll put this out there in the public, is going to say it's okay to legally discriminate against certain religions, especially Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs, you can do what you want to do. That's fine. I'm not going to come. I'm not going to spend my money. And so I consciously, even though I love this city, haven't been here since 2018, and I'm pointing at Professor Sharma, I came because of his invitation. You know, when he said, would you come to this conference, my first thought was, no, I'm sorry, I won't go to Quebec because of what's happening here. And then I said, but can I talk about what's happening here? Can I ask about what, and he says, absolutely. I said, okay. So that's why I'm here. And it's a personal thing for me to say, okay, should I come here? But you know, here in Quebec, you don't need me to tell you about this, Bill 21 in 2019. And I love the fact of respecting the laïcité of the state, you know, again, directly tied to what's happening in France. I mentioned my friend Olivier Roy, amazing, amazing scholar of Islam. And years ago, it must have been almost 20 years ago, Columbia University Press was thinking about translating one of his books, La laïcité face à l'islam, into English, and they sent me the book and said, hey, could you read this, and you know, do you think we should translate it? And it was great for me to sort of keep working on my French. And I thought, oh, this is a brilliant book, but you're gonna have to explain to Americans what laïcité means. And so, because most Americans confuse, you know, freedom of religion, freedom from religion, secularism. When we say America is a secular country, we don't mean America is not a religious country. It's off the charts religious. I mean, compared to Europe, like, you know, half the folks in the Netherlands, or more than half, are atheists. So, you know, to be a religious person in Europe is to be the minority, roughly speaking. To be a religious person in America is to be still in the majority there. So when it's a secular country, it's not a religious country there. So Columbia took my advice, translated the book, but of course they didn't take my advice, and the English translation of La laïcité face à l'islam is Islam confronts secularism. I'm like, yeah, no, that's not what it is. Laïcité is a particular kind of thing here that allows people to do certain things. So I don't want to talk about that because, again, it's not something I've worked on. It's something you live through here. I want to learn from you about that. That's part of my reason for being here, is to learn more from you about this. I want to talk about something else, which is the work that I do, and sometimes it's helpful to look at other situations, other contexts, as a way of providing perspective on our own. And so I think about the history of Islam and Muslims in America. I think about the history of Islam and Muslims in Canada. I mentioned my mentor, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, this extraordinary sort of scholar. Some of you may know his big brother Arnold, who was like the first Secretary General of the Commonwealth. So there's a really interesting sort of family here, where his brother worked with the Commonwealth. And you think about, okay, what does that mean for Muslims? Because we were part of this. Syed Hussain, no relation, has a beautiful chapter in the Anne Brayman books, the Islamophobia in Canada book, that talks about precisely that colonial context there. You know, I'm still living in the US now for 25 years. I still collect Canadian coins, and the Canadian Mint had a wonderful large-size replica of the 1947 nickel, which was the last one that had George VI with his title of Emperor of India. You know, and you think about that what does it mean that I was born in Lahore, which when I was born was Pakistan. When my father was born, this was India, you know, there. And this was a British colony, you know. King George was the Emperor of India. You know, lots of Muslims had things to do with building up that Commonwealth, you know, but we don't think about that history. Same thing in the US. And so this is really what I want to focus on, just as an example for the rest of my talk here. I'm old for my students. I'm older than their parents, but it's always good to remind them there were things that happened even before I was born. This picture is a great one. Malcolm X talking to then technically still Cassius Clay, because it's at this day that he sort of reveals to the world that he's no longer Cassius Clay, he's Muhammad Ali. If you haven't seen the Regina King film, and as someone who lives in Los Angeles, I have to shout out films. It's part of our contract with the city. Regina King's One Night in Miami, amazing, amazing film about the night that Cassius Clay then wins the World Heavyweight Championship from Sonny Liston, and that night celebrates with his friends, Malcolm X, Jim Brown, the great football player, and Sam Cooke, the R&B singer. So it's a fictionalized account of that, but a wonderful, wonderful movie that talks about this real event. And then it was the next day that Cassius Clay declared publicly that he was no longer Cassius Clay, he's Malcolm X. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, thanks in part to his friend Malcolm X. And we don't talk about Malcolm enough. I mean, we don't talk civil rights enough. We don't talk about Dr. King enough in the US. Forget about talking about Malcolm, or after his trip to Mecca and his renaming himself again as El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. And again, I think of that, and I'll give you a second to read that quote there and think, okay, we're coming up on over almost exactly 60 years ago when he said this. And he could have said it today in America with the same force, you know. Haven't pulled the knife out. You know, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. You know, progress is healing the wound. They haven't even pulled the knife, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there. You know, where do these things intersect? Because of course the religious discrimination isn't in and of itself its own. I mean, that's certainly part of it, and that's the great thing about academic inquiry. But where does it intersect with race, with class, with gender, with all those kinds of markers of identity here? You know? And I think of James Cone at Union Theological Seminary, you know, one of the key figures in Black liberation theology, and one of his great books on this, you know, Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. And it was really interesting. He talked about growing up as a young African-American person, you know, in the 60s, and hearing this sort of choice between, you know, Malcolm, Muslim, militant, violent, even though Malcolm wasn't violent. Like I've gotten into issues with some of my colleagues about calling Malcolm nonviolent. Well, how can you call him violent? Like, he never said go out there and kill people. He never said, you know, take up guns and start shooting there, you know, versus the sort of nonviolence. And again, this is the connection that, you know, many of us who work in this area know, that it was Jim Lawson in LA who'd gone to India, who'd learned things about nonviolence from Indian Dharmic traditions, come back and started talking with his friend Martin King, you know, about this. So really interesting connections here. But as Professor Cohen says, you couldn't separate these two. You know, it's like to use the images of your hands, your right and left hand. You know, where's the flame? Where's the power there? You know, there's war going on in black and white America, writing about the 60s, between Martin and Malcolm. Everyone was forced to choose sides, but I could not. You know, I needed both Martin and Malcolm to defend black humanity under assault by white supremacy in America, and I understood why they talked differently about Christianity and blackness, nonviolence and violence, love and hate. You know, it's really this interesting moment. You know, you look at Jim Wallace, for example, you know, in America with Sojourners, you know, often having said, look, if American Christians were more Christian than were American, it'd be a very different sort of society. So, you know, where does the race, the nationalism, the religion, all these things, you know, intersect? These things don't occur in a vacuum here. You know? And you think of that history, because there's this rich history. Most of us think that, you know, Muslims are relative newcomers, and there's some truth to that, to America. You know, most of us are people like me, immigrants, children of immigrants, people who've been since 1965 with changes to immigration law, about the same time that Canada was changing its immigration laws, and we can talk about all the different things that happened with immigration laws, and again, this is more for the discussion, the Bill 21 and the sort of notwithstanding Section 33 of the Charter Clause, and you think, okay, so what does that mean? Could you bring back residential schools? Can you bring back Chinese exclusion? You know, can you bring back these kinds of things? We intern the Japanese? I never learned that we intern the Japanese, but we intern the Japanese. Can you bring that back? Can you do those kinds of things? You know, but we don't think about the history, and there's this rich history of Muslims in America. You know, yeah, most of us have been here since '65, but we were here before the country was the country. You know, the first Muslim that we can trace as an African slave was Estevanico the Moor, brought 1528. So again, coming up on almost 500 years of a Muslim slave, you know, in the Americas. This is, you know, this amazing sort of piece here by President Barack Obama Presidents, of course, when they get inaugurated in January, often one of the first things you do is go off and do lots of tours and travel and visit countries as the new president. So in June, President Obama went to Cairo, sort of the heart of the Arab world, and gave this address. And this isn't the whole address, by the way, but this was part of it, and really talked about some of the history, of Islam in America. Since our founding, Americans was in the United States, fought in our wars, served in our government, stood for civil rights. And that was really important, I think, for people to realize, oh, there's a history here. And I've talked about that connection with race and ethnicity. The first Muslims that were brought over as slaves, African slaves. I was a kid watching the 1977 television version of Roots, where Alex Haley traces his family's, roots, and it's LeVar Burton as Kunta Kinte, the ancestor that's brought to America, to Annapolis in 1730, and he's Muslim. Like, wait, there were Muslims? Kunta Kinte's a Muslim? There were Muslim slaves? Well, of course. We know Islam has been in Africa, especially West Africa, since the 9th century. Why are you surprised that some of the slaves brought over from West Africa were Muslim? A decade or so ago, when there was the controversy about the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in Manhattan, 51 Park Place, should we build a mosque at the old Burlington Coat Factory? Do we need this in lower Manhattan? And this idea, well, no, you can't build a mosque here. 19 Muslims took down the towers. This is sacred ground. 3,000 people died here. And you want to say, okay, so if the ground is defined as sacred because the dead are buried in it, what about the dead that have been there long before 9/11? If you know New York, I encourage you, if you go to New York City, obviously go to the 9/11 Memorial in the museum. Walk 6 blocks away from it, down Duane Street. And you'll come up with this. You see the black and white picture where they were doing some work in 1991, building a new government building, and they found bones, and of course you have to stop. They bring in the archaeologists. They realize, oh, this is actually a burial site, the African burial site of African slaves. And so it was opened in 2006 by President George W. Bush as the African Burial Ground National Monument. And this idea that, we know some of the people that were buried there because of the things that they were buried with. Not a rosary, but the misbah, the prayer beads with like 11 prayer beads, Hand of Fatima, that some of these dead were Muslim dead, or at least had, objects that indicated that they had connections with the Islamic world with them. So, to say, okay, the dead is what make this sacred. What about the Muslim dead that are there? What about the history of slavery that we don't talk about? Sylvain Diouf, who's now at Brown University visiting there, is the woman that's written the most, or the person that's written the most about African slaves in the Americas. These are some of her books, Servants of Allah probably being the most famous of those books there. But to say that you have this history, there's a richness here. I remember one of Michelle Obama's last addresses as First Lady, she said, very famously, I wake up every morning in a house built by slaves, and people lost their mind, And you want to say, well, and I have to remind my American students, when the British burnt the White House down in it wasn't Canadians, it was the British, let's be clear here, in 1812, burnt down the White House. Who do you think rebuilt it? Do you think we brought in there's great Estonian stonemasons, there's great Russian stone cutters. We used slave labor to build the White House, and but just we don't think about that, including African slave labor, African Muslim slave labor. If we look at Muslim lives in the U.S., really interesting. At least a quarter of us are African American, people who've been American for generations. My great hero, Muhammad Ali, that I talked about. This is the famous Cleveland Summit. It's odd to look at that picture. So in 1964, Ali declares he's no longer Cassius Clay, he's Muhammad Ali, member of the Nation of Islam. 1967, refuses induction into the U.S. Army with the Vietnam War on the grounds of being a Muslim. Jim Brown, who's in the middle in front of the microphone, hosts this summit in Cleveland. And it's odd looking at this picture because it's Bill Russell, it's the men seated, Bill Russell on the left, Ali, Jim Brown, and a young then Lou Alcindor, who was a sophomore at UCLA before he'd become Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And to think that Bill Russell, Ali, Jim Brown are all gone there, and you think about a time in which athletes were sort of involved, the civil rights part, what does it mean to say, hey, for religious reasons, as a member of the Nation of Islam, this war is wrong. What does that mean? How do we look at that there? And, of the four, it's only Kareem that's still there. And we were privileged to have him at my university. And you get a sense of the size of the man. He's sitting, he's about my size, Been a long time since I looked another grown man in the chest, He was our commencement speaker in 2019, and what I'm giving him, and you can see it around my neck, is the stole from our Office of Muslim Student Life, and we give that to our Muslim students. We're a small Catholic university, 6,000 students, maybe 250 Jewish students, maybe 250 Muslim students, and so having Muslim student life, Jewish student life on campus. And he really appreciated this because there was no Office of Muslim Student Life, and he was at UCLA in 1967, so it's really interesting to see those kinds of changes. I think he genuinely appreciated that. So a quarter of us American Muslims, are African American. A third are Middle Eastern, but Middle Eastern could mean Arab, it could mean Iranian. You look at Shirin Neshat, one of the great artists in the world. This Iranian Muslim woman who, spends half her time in like a lot of Iranians do, in Los Angeles there. The Broad Museum had this amazing retrospective of her work 3 years ago, I guess. It was just phenomenal. I Will Greet the Sun Again, this amazing artist. We can talk later because I was talking to Ed Shad, the curator at the Broad, of this, and he says, Shirin's now gotten into issues with folks in the liberation movement in Iran because they don't like some of her earlier images. I'm like, wait, how are we taking these things out of context? It was Shannon's things about context, that you're telling me Shirin Neshat is not somehow supportive of women's rights in Iran. If she isn't, who is? But that's a whole other, kind of thing of how your work often gets misused sometimes by people. So, a third of us American Muslims, Middle Eastern, a little over a third of us, people like me, South Asians, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Fazl Rahman, the Bengali structural engineer who made possible the building of the Sears Tower, the John Hancock building. The reason we have these sort of tall structures is because of him. It was nice to see in 2016 Colin Kaepernick, again, that intersection of religion with politics. You kneel because of what you see as the place of black folks, not out of disrespect, not disrespecting the flag, nothing like that. And then, again, then President Trump had lots to say about Colin. None of it was good there. But people don't remember that 20 years earlier, Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, converts to Islam from becoming Chris Jackson, becomes Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, basketball player for the Denver Nuggets, for one game refuses to stand for the national anthem. And it's a really interesting Islamic question. Can you stand for the anthem? Because is standing for the anthem standing for something other than God? Are you giving your allegiance to God, or are you giving it to the country, to the flag, to the anthem? Really, really interesting kinds of things there. Just finishing up here, 2016, at the death of Muhammad Ali, the funeral here, one of the speakers, and Ali had his janazah, his traditional Muslim funeral, and then he had the public sort of state funeral. This is Atila Shabazz, the oldest daughter of Malcolm X, ambassador, not American, Belize. She was made an ambassador by the government of Belize, so that's where the title comes from. But she was talking about her family and her time. And I love this, because she's talking about her father, Malcolm X. I can't imagine being her, being a young girl watching literally your dad get murdered on the stage of the Audubon ballroom. My dad would often state when concluding a party from another, may we meet again in the light of understanding. And I say to you, with the light of that compass, by any means necessary. Malcolm's sort of famous line that almost always again gets misused there. But who are the people that are doing this, who are doing this work to help better the society? And does society understand, what's going on there? Quick thing here, not to get into what we're going to talk about later in Professor Loeffler's thing, but you look at some of those connections. I've been interested in this since 2015 when Susanna Heschel asked me to be part of a thing that she was doing at Oxford, on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And that was that moment of, oh, right, in the American imagination, Jews and Muslims were construed as exactly the same. The sort of images of Muslims, the images of Jews, the hook-nosed, bearded, lascivious, sort of money-grubbing, could be Jew, could be Arab, didn't really matter. there. And you look at some of those connections, which for me really came home 2017. I was literally flying back from DC the day of the first travel ban there. And, you saw this. So the Friday at 4:42, very famously, the sort of first iteration of the travel ban gets enacted. Saturday and Sunday, there's sort of chaos as to what happens. This was on the Sunday coming back and seeing the connection, and it was the Jewish community in America that was really at the forefront of this, to say, okay, we know where this road leads, and so to say, we will stand with our Muslim, brothers and sisters. This was actually in DC, around the time of the travel ban. But I'll finish here, and I apologize for going a minute or so late. When President Obama talked about, when the first one was elected to Congress, first Muslim elected to Congress, that was Keith Ellison, elected in 2006, sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Really interesting thing. Again, we can get into this, as the first Muslim elected to Congress, everyone is sworn in publicly in a ceremony. Nancy Pelosi, their Speaker of the House, and then they go back to their chambers, do their private sort of ceremony. And as the first Muslim elected to Congress from Minnesota, interesting enough, the Hamline controversy, wanted to be sworn in a Quran. And people went mad. You can't be sworn in a Quran, you have to be sworn in a Bible. And you want to say, actually, no, you don't, because that would be a religious test. And one of the things that makes America America is you don't have a religious test. You don't have to belong to a religion in order to hold office. And so he just goes across the street from Congress and checks out, what you could do as a congressman, Thomas Jefferson's Quran. 1765, Thomas Jefferson buys the George Sale translation of the Quran. So this fabulous sort of picture. And I don't know how Nancy still looks the same 20 years later. There's a backstory there. But here he is being sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Quran. But I end not with that picture of Keith, but with this picture, because after the murder of George Floyd, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Keith Ellison had left the Congress and come back to Minnesota and was the Attorney General in the state of Minnesota. He was the Attorney General that prosecuted the man that murdered George Floyd and did it successfully. Did he do it because he's an American Muslim? No, not at all. He did it because he's a damn good, darn good lawyer, and knew the law, knew what you could get a conviction on, with a jury. But also an American Muslim. And so to think, okay, where does that come in? And the George Floyd case is a whole other complicated thing we get into, because of course the store that starts the sort of thing with George wanting to pass a counterfeit $20 bill is owned by a Palestinian Muslim family, and so there's really interesting things that happen there. But where I'm going with this is that, to me, this is where these things intersect, where they collide. You've got this American Muslim who's now the Attorney General, who prosecutes the white officer who murders African-American man there. And so you look at the civil rights, you look at the history, it's still there, but we don't really talk about it, I think, as much as we should. So let me stop there, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for a wonderful and passionate presentation, and I think it's indeed so important to know the personal histories and the history of what we're doing. It's not just a theoretical discussion. So we have some time for questions, discussion, please to the microphone, both to Professor Hussain and maybe also together, the both members of the panel. Yes, please, and say your name too, please. Thank you.
So, hello, I'm Jeffrey Long. You're all going to hear from me tomorrow. But I wanted to ask a question to Amir. Wonderful, fantastic presentation, an inspirational presentation. I just want to ask you about something, and I don't know how comfortable you are talking about it, but recently, and you and I have corresponded about this, you were quite stupidly, in my opinion, taken to task for mentioning the Muslim Students Organization at your institution. I thought of this when you showed the photo of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And someone on an academic listserv that we're both part of objected. And then I objected to the objection because I have my, Vedanta quotes at the bottom of my signature, and no one ever minds. And I say, you know, what is the problem here?
Okay.
And the fact that there's Islamophobia in the academy too is unnerving, to say the least. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts and reflections on that whole experience.
No, and it was a weird moment. And thank you, Professor Long, for that. So it was this moment of, it's one of those things, like, you can't make this up, you know. What's the old line, truth is stranger than fiction? Of course it is, because, you know, fiction has to make sense, you know, there. And so we have a position, the Jain community has been very generous in the last couple of years of funding positions. So we have a position, the Bhagwan Malanath Professor of Jain Studies. And so I was, at that point, I wasn't. I'd stopped being chair of the department, but I was chair of the search committee. And so you send this out on a listserv for academics, say, oh, by the way, we have this great, you know, position in Jain Studies, please apply. And I just sent it out under my email, which of course, you know, in addition to have my information, has a tagline for this book, and then a thing to say, oh, if you're interested in making a donation for Muslim Student Life, you know, click on this link. And someone objected, saying, you know, how dare I, for a position of Islam, you know, talk about Muslim Student Life? And I'm like, I literally didn't know what to do with that, because it was like, wait, what? Like, you're objecting to this link on, and you're connecting, like, no, there's no connection between the position, but that's my signature. That's just sort of what I send out. And just this moment that somehow, you know, and I'm not going to get into the tone of the email, but it was this sense of, you know, but Muslims are intolerant, they take over, and they do this kind of thing. And I'm like, but we you know, we have, and it's really interesting how things happen. So we opened a dedicated Muslim prayer space at my university in 2016, and you get the sort of conservative sort of things. And I got a couple of folks who sort of wanted to have me say something like, oh yes, there's a mosque now, and it's not a mosque, it's a sort of prayer space that the Muslim students can use. It's about 200 square feet. It's not like, it's basically like a converted classroom, you know, kind of thing. And I said something to the effect, oh yeah, and don't worry, there's still 6 places every day where we celebrate Mass. So it's not like the chapel is being turned into the masjid or anything like that. But I think like that sense of like the fear and the playing into the fear, I think is really problematic. And I think, Professor Long didn't say this for me to give a shout out to him, but I really appreciated what you did there, because I think those are the kinds of things that are important. That, you know, do we stand up for each other, you know, or do we say, well, I don't care about that, it has nothing to do with me. But then when it has something to do with me, that happens. You know, I was talking with Professor Loeffler about this, that, you know, we have this really great, I think, connection of our Muslim students and our Jewish students on our campus, but I think precisely because it's a Catholic campus, and again, out of 6,000 students, about half of them are Catholic, about half aren't, but only about 250 are Muslim, about 250 are Jewish. You know, if you know LMU, you know Chris Chappell, who's been there for decades and created the first MA in Yoga Studies, you know, program there. We have you know, Hindu students, Sikh students, Jain students, you know, Buddhist students there. It's LA, so you have that kind of diversity. But between the Muslim and the Jewish students, I think making those kinds of connections precisely because we're not, I mean, Wilfred has a great thing about, you know, what, Wilfred Campbell Smith, sorry, about non-Christian, using non-Christian, you know, and the problems with that. But, you know, as non-Christians, you know, we have this sort of connection with each other. And so it's exactly that moment of do you come together? Do you do this kind of thing? And, you know, we had a vigil on the Tuesday, the 10th, I guess, of October, you know, for the lives lost at that point with the Hamas terrorist attacks. And it was this weird moment of thinking, talking with Rabbi Zach Zeisman, our rabbi on campus, that, oh yeah, last time we were there having a vigil for people killed was 5 years ago for Tree of Life Synagogue, you know. And you look at that and think, okay, without getting into that story, you know, why was the Tree of Life Synagogue targeted? Was it only anti-Semitism? Or was it the fact that, you know, you had the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society there, and these were people who were literally working to bring refugees there? And again, it's that moment, like this book, not to turn into a shameless plug for the book, but the last book here about Muslim America begins with Sharon Browse's Rosh Hashanah sermon, you know, in 2015, where she talked about the history of Jews in America not being wanted, refugees during World War II. You know, anyone that goes to Israel and goes to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, you know, has their own reactions. One of the most visceral reactions that I had to a piece at Yad Vashem was actually not what you would think. It was a letter by I can't remember, and even if I could remember, I'm not going to name him. It was a congressman who the Jewish community in his district had asked to have some Jewish refugees brought. And he basically wrote them a letter, or Jewish refugee children, excuse me. So not just refugees, but children as refugees. And he basically said, well, thank you very much. If you got the money to bring these people over, don't you have the money to help support us and this kind of thing? And we already have enough people there. And so just that moment of the Jewish community knows this, and tells the story, Rabbi Brous, of the ship that was brought, with refugees that was sent back. You can't come here. A third of them die in the Holocaust. Made me think of, again, using the colonial history, the Canadian government issued a stamp about this. The Komagato Maru, the Indian ship with Sikhs from the Punjab who weren't allowed to dock in Vancouver. Again, because we have too many Indians already there. But just that moment. So here's Rabbi Brous on Rosh Hashanah saying the Jewish community should help in bringing refugees. She started with that image that is seared in people's minds of Elaine Kurdi, the toddler who was drowned trying to escape what was happening in Syria. And so this sense of, back to Professor Long, we have to make those connections. And that's one of the reasons I think Professor Sharma and Professor Kirkpatrick, this is so important, because it's not just about this or this or this. It's how do these things link up? Where do these things work together, and what do we do, as academics here? Because of course we have our areas of expertise, but what I love about that, and that was Wilfred here, and I'll stop here because I can tell Wilfred stories all day. When he came here to McGill and then created the Institute for Islamic Studies, Wilfred was very, very British. He drank coffee, so that wasn't British, but he understood tea. And so he made sure that at 4 o'clock, everyone came out of their offices. I think there were like 11 people that he'd first hired. Everyone came out of their offices at 4 o'clock and had tea. What that meant was they talked with each other. And I love that. I've always said if someone makes me dean, the first thing I'm going to do is, okay, let's have a room where we'll have free coffee and muffins for breakfast. Only rule is you have to stay there. You can't take them back to your office. You got to talk to each other. That's the university, that we can have these kinds of conversations here. I think that's really the crucial thing there. Yes, please. I think they're recording it, so I think that's the reason for the microphone.
Hey, so I'm a non-Canadian. Also, my expertise is not in religious studies or theology or anything, but in my other area of expertise, which is education, in the learning of these type of subjects, I think in a less religious perspective, what criminalizes, specifically, because we're talking about, is it fear? Is it hatred?
Right.
And yesterday I was listening to one of my colleagues. He was watching a documentary on the criminalization of Black Americans in the United States. And listening to you, it just reminded me with 9/11, the criminalization not only of Muslim people, but also of Sikhs, which clearly shows where the religious symbols and the criminalization came from, and also nowadays with the Israel and Palestinian conflict. So I guess I don't have kind of like a question, but it's more like from other perspectives that may not come from like a religious or theological perspective. It's like, what are we teaching our people? How are we truly, from professors that may approach these type of subjects, but without the religious expertise, how are we truly approaching as educators these concerns?
Thank you for that. It's a great question and comment. I think, and I remind my students all the time, the name of Balbir Singh Sodhi. He was the first person killed in a hate crime post 9/11. He was a Sikh gas station attendant from Mesa, Arizona. Kavi Raz has a film, A Golden Bracelet, talking about that story. And here's this guy who comes from India, wants to work hard, wants to be a success, owns a gas station in Mesa, Arizona, and I can't remember if it's a Thursday or Friday. 9/11 happens on a Tuesday. It's either the Thursday or the Friday that he's shot to death. Because, of course, as a Sikh, he's got a turban, he's got brown skin, he's got a long beard. And, to the man that shoots him, he looks like a Taliban. He's not Muslim, he's not, Arab, he's a Sikh. He's got nothing to do with this, but sort of looks the part. And so I think part of it is, do we understand the kinds of intersectionalities? Do we understand the connections here? Like I said, until that conference and beginning that work with Susanna Heschel about anti-Semitism, I didn't realize exactly those kinds of tropes. I don't work in that, but just to see some of those pictures, some of those images, the characterizations, didn't really matter for those purposes whether the person was Jewish or Muslim, because exactly the same sort of list of tropes there. I think the key again is first of all, do we have those conversations with experts, and then do we do it in a good way? And Shannon's presentation was just really spot on, I think, talking about academic freedom and some of the ways in which that sort of connects with other things. And I always say to people, look, academic freedom means you have the right to pursue research on controversial subjects. It doesn't give you the right to be a dick, And so I think that's part of it is you can't just say, well, I can do this because of my academic freedom. You might be able to do something, but should you do it? That kind of thing. Do you wait? And I'm not saying that to my students all the time. Do you wake up in the morning and think, there's really not enough ignorance and hatred and violence in the world. Let me add some more to it, Or do you say, you know what, there's a lot of ignorance and violence and hatred in the world. Maybe I can sort of, at least if I don't add to it, maybe detract from it a little bit, work a little bit. And for me, again, that's the beauty of the university setting, first generation, first kid in the family to go to university. And to have that encounter with people who had really smart ideas about this and this and this and this, but then to have those kinds of conversations, where do you make those connections? How do you make that change, there? And I think, and I'll stop here, I say this all the time, look, education is really hard work. That's why we do it, because if it wasn't hard, why do it? Indoctrination is easy. It's easy to indoctrinate students. It's easy to tell students, here's the story. As opposed to, no, it's a little more complicated than that. And what if there's more than one story, here? And so that's, I think, what we try to do here. How do we educate our students about the history, about the complexity, about the connections? Again, and I'll stop where I started. Wilfred Cantwell Smith. It's all about persons. It's all about the faith of persons. Wilfred going to Lahore before partition, because of course India was the country with the most Muslims. Wanted to study Muslims, go to a country that has Muslims. In 1940, India has the most Muslims. Stays there till 46, comes back before partition, goes back in 48 and sees what has happened with the violence. And realizes that, I can't be the scientist and the objective scientist in the white lab coat that says, what a curious phenomenon. 500,000 people seem to have killed each other. Let us you can't. You have to say this is wrong. How do we stop this? What do we do here? That engagement in the world, I think, is so crucial. It goes back to what Shannon was saying, that's professors who have that, I think, obligation, especially those of you, I say this as someone who teaches in a private school, those of you who teach in public institutions where the funding comes from the public, although now I guess it's not a lot of public funding that comes because the governments have shrunk there. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I just have, Amir, maybe this is just simply a comment, but more than anything else. What strikes me from what both of you have been saying is that we in fact don't tell stories very well. And so from generation to generation, the stories aren't told, even here in the university. What has struck me in bringing together a very small group of people has been the number of letters that have been written to try to stop it. This. And by individuals who, for all intents and purposes, are very sane and very logical in their thinking, but feel very strongly that this position or that position ought never to be able to be articulated in a university, let alone subsidized by the public purse. Now, those of us who are over the age of retirement and should retire and should have done, maybe have longer memories than others, but it is important that we tell the stories. And I love the book. It's wonderful. 6 years ago, when there was a celebration here in this chapel of the 500th anniversary of the founder of Sikhism, whose name I've never been able to pronounce, but I should be able to, and so I'll practice it even more. But I was astounded at what it was that I learned about what it was that the Sikh community did for the building of Canada that I never knew. So this kind of discussion, this kind of back and forth, I really do appreciate, not least because I remember when this chapel was taken siege and hostage because there was no place for the Muslim students to pray. And so we scurried around and we said, well, we'll make the chapel all right for you. And then we couldn't because we couldn't find running water that was sufficient. So we had to figure something else out. But yeah, if stories aren't told to the generation now that are just coming into their being tenured, then I think we failed at an even perhaps deeper level at the university. Anyway, that's just a comment.